In this video, we're going to look at solder braid. Solder braid is a fancy copper wire that acts like a sponge to molten solder. It's a consumable, so as you use up the solder braid, you have to cut it off and dispose of the bit that you use. I've got a couple of different rolls of solder braid here, and one's been sitting around for some time and one's pretty fresh. Sometimes you might want to add some flux to your solder braid to help it work. Mostly, the solder braid will come with flux built into it already. This is copper, and copper conducts heat very well. The copper can get so hot that it will melt the plastic up here. So if you hold your solder braid like this, the heat's going to travel up the copper and hurt your fingers. Now there's a few different ways to use solder braid. The first way is like this. You take your soldering iron and you put it over the copper braid and over the pad you want to desolder, and drag the solder braid out from underneath the tip and the solder pad. You'll see that the solder braid is starting to take up some of that solder. There's all of this area here that's unused. That's because there's either a very small amount of flux in here, or the flux has gone off, or maybe there wasn't much flux in here to start with. So I'm going to add some flux to this, and we'll see how it works again. Here I've got a little bit of rosin flux, and I'm just going to add a tiny bit, and maybe that's too much. Using too much flux on the solder braid won't hurt anything. Flux isn't cheap, so let's not waste it. Straight away, you can see there's a big difference. Most of the solder's off. There's still a little bit there, and solder wick will never get all of the solder off your joint. Now I've used up this part of the solder braid, I'm going to chop it off and dispose of that part. Let's do that again. As you can tell, I've added some flux to that solder braid because it's sucking the solder all the way up the solder braid. This isn't going to soak up any more solder because, as you can see, it's already soaked up the solder. This is why a lot of people prefer solder pumps over solder braid. The other way to use solder braid is like this. If I put the solder braid down along a row of joins like this, and I take my soldering iron and run it along the joins, you'll see that the solder will suck up quite nicely into the braid. There's the gotcha using this method. And if you leave the solder braid down like this, you're going to solder the solder braid to your row of joins. Before I was saying let's add some flux, and maybe I added too much flux. You can see here these black patches. This is flux that hasn't burnt off yet. I'm going to do that again. Pretty good. When you're using solder braid to remove solder, you'll not get it all. You'll always have a little bit left. And that could be a good thing. So you can see how much solder wick we've used to take off that much solder. It's a fair bit, isn't it? So here I've soldered some header on these pins here. And you can see that I've really put way too much solder across here. So let's use a little bit of solder braid to remove most of that solder. So here's my solder braid here, and I'm going to lay my solder braid over these joins. And I'm just going to run, I hope you can see that, I'm just going to run my soldering iron down these joins, and you'll see that the braid will soak up some of that excess solder. Oh dear, I'm chasing it around. I might do a video on helping hands yet. And so there's the joins left. You can see here I haven't removed very much solder over here, but these joins over here, they're looking much better.